It's so nice to see familiar faces, from different countries that we've worked across as impacted by US militarism. Some of you I've met and know and have been to my home, and others of you are my Facebook friends. So it's so nice to put like a live face to some of the people that we connect with. It's really, this feels like such an amazingly safe space to talk about peace and resistance, so sometimes we're presenting against people that we know don't agree with our positions, but here it feels like we're all connected in some way. And I mean, of course we're connected in some way, but what it seems to be emerging in terms of just the introductions and the sharing is the connection by way of spirituality, right? And it took me about 5 years to realize that all the best activists in the globe were very deeply spiritually connected, and so I really appreciate this space that Kaia, you've created through the center to have these discussions, because really that oftentimes is the motivation for our work, is much deeper spiritual meaning in terms of why we resist, because certainly resisting is not easy. But so I'm Lisa Natividad. I'm with the University of Guam. I'm with the Guam Coalition for Peace and Justice. And for some of you who've come to Guam, you know that our activist community really is one small group of a critical mass. And so different labels in terms of our affiliations, but those are the two that are indicated for this presentation. I'm a mother. I have a son whose name is Addaumami. He's now 21 years old. I live in the southern part of our island in the village of Guahan. And I'm just a daughter of Guahan. I have to say that in our resistance work for demilitarization and decolonization and denuclearization of the planet, our first engagement really was with activists in Japan. And they, because of the announcement of a transfer of Marines from Okinawa to our island, flung the door open and welcomed us in terms of catching us up to speed in terms of militarism. And so the solidarity that we've been able to foster, certainly in the Asia Pacific region, because we're all collectively impacted very closely, and now focusing as well our efforts in the Pacific region through the Pacific Peace Network. And the third affiliation for me really is with the International Network of Women Against Militarism. And so this is a network that's been around for about 25, 30 years, and they really were the ones that brought Guam activists under their wing. We hosted one of their meetings in 2009, which was critically timed because of the military construction that was planned for our island. So I'm going to begin with, I'm going to be using a PowerPoint for my talk today. So if you just indulge me, I will get the screen share going here. Okay, and so my talk will center around the question, what has the militarization of Guahan meant for the US's tip of the spear? Let me set my timer here, okay. So to begin, I wanted to illustratively discuss where we are, right? So we refer to our homeland as Guahan, which is our indigenous name for our island, which in our language means we have. And so it really is an endearing term that we have for our homeland, in that our homeland has been able to provide for us for a very long time. Our earliest migration pattern into our region suggests that we've been here for about 4,000 years. And so when I talk about Guahan, we're located in the North Pacific Island. And so in the North Pacific, we're part of the southernmost point of the Mariana Island chain, which is here. And so sometimes you'll hear about military and base development in the island of Saipan, or even in Tinian, which is one of these northern islands, but it is from here where I come. And we are in the Micronesian region of Oceania. And as I shared earlier, in the northern part of the Pacific. We are not the independent part of the Pacific in terms of political status. And so for most in the Pacific, when they say Micronesia, they think about the countries of Kiribati and Nauru, but we are the other part of the Micronesia that from the Pacific context is referred to as the American Pacific. And so this here is a map of our region of Micronesia with the US map superimposed on top, which in so many metaphorical ways represents a lot of things, but it does give you and glean, and you can see too the Philippines here on the absolute left of the map. It gives you an idea of the expanse of space that we're talking about when we're talking about Micronesia, right? So we're big space, largely connected by the ocean, by Moana Nui. And so the ocean connects us. And although we are small islands, we do, as part of our understanding of the world and how we engage, our worldview includes the expanse of space, which is the ocean. And so the title of my talk mentions the US's tip of the spear. And so this slide, which actually originated from the Department of Defense, clearly shows Guam's strategic importance in terms of the US Department of Defense's militarization plans. And so our island being centered here, as you can see, our proximity to Asia, being embedded in the Pacific, and our proximity to Hawaii, which is one of the US's 50 states, although there are issues in terms of sovereignty and the taking of the lands of the Hawaiian people or the Kanaka Maoli. So you can see that with these various red triangles, these if you can imagine that they're two-sided spears, they all converge on Guahan. And these triangles really represent oftentimes different stages of military exercises that are held within the region. And so you can see just by virtue of this map exactly how critical our island is in terms of the US and its plans. And so just a few demographic information. Our population is in the ballpark between 160 and 170,000 people. The Department of Defense population hovers around 15,000. What was anticipated, the number has shifted, but at present it is about 40,000 population increase for our island with the new relocation of Marines. And the Department of Defense owns roughly 40,000 acres, with our local government of Guam owning even less than that in terms of the island's resources. And so yet another map, this is of our island again, and it has where we are contextualized in the Asia Pacific region, but I wanted to use this map to highlight the existence of US Department of Defense military bases. Very famous in the military world is our Andersen Air Force Base to the north. And then we have here towards the central part of the island, the naval base complexes that comprise and are situated in Apra Harbor, which, as you can see from this photo, you can see how ideal Apra Harbor is in terms of providing this haven for naval ships. But we also have a number of different installations all throughout the island, as well as their possession of our lands that haven't been fully developed into bases. Andersen Air Force Base to the north is, the reason I say that it is a rather famous base is because it is on this base where the Air Force houses B-2 stealth bombers, which in the tensions that have been rising between the United States and the DPRK is where the bombers would be sent to detonate and to bomb the DPRK in the event that the US were to strike first. And so it's for that reason that DPRK retaliates with saying, and this is all just verbal stuff, that if they were to be bombed, that they would then bomb our island because that's where those bombs would have originated from. And so who are we? I'm an indigenous Chamorro. Our people date back to our islands and our island chain to about 2000 BCE. And our legends tell of humanity being born of Foha Rock in the southern village of Humatak. And so that's what's inserted in this photo here. And I share that because our longevity in our islands is such that we really, before contact with the Western world, had our, as is evidenced in our cosmology, show that we saw ourselves as the bearers of the creation of and the starting of humanity. And so I'm shifting a little bit to talk about our historical context so that you can understand our colonial experience. And so our first contact that's documented with the Western world was on March 6th of 1521, when Magellan, sailing under the Spanish flag, stumbled upon us, claimed us for Spain. However, we were left relatively untouched until the mid-1600s, during which time Catholic missions were established and set on the island. And that really began the Hispanization as well as the Catholicism, the introduction of Catholicism onto our people. That also was the start of a lot of Chamorro-Spanish wars. And so the decimation of our population, partly due to the wars, but also largely due to the diseases that were brought in for which we had no immunity. And so we remained under the Spanish influence until the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898, wherein through the Treaty of Paris, our island was ceded to the United States for a small sum of money. And then we remained under the US's jurisdiction. We were run really as though we were a military ship. The island was governed through an appointed admiral by the US Department of Defense. And so in terms of the democratic sphere and structure, it didn't exist really at that time. And we remained that way until World War II, during which between 1941 and 1944, we were invaded by the Japan Imperial Army. And so just under 3 years was this war period. And then the US came back to reoccupy in July of 1944 and continues to stay on our island through the present. And so we are presently an unincorporated territory, which is akin to that of a modern day colony of the United States. What is noteworthy to mention, however, is that in 1950 was the passage of the Organic Act of Guam in the US Congress that created a local government of Guam, which gave us a little bit of some degree of self-governance, however, is not full self-governance by any means. And of course, we're a non-self-governing territory as recognized by the United Nations, and we continue to be on the list of non-self-governing territories, of which there are just 17 left in the world, of a list that was established since 1960, when it was clear that having colonies was not acceptable and the rest of the world was allowed to decolonize. And so our people have endured over 350 years of colonization. And when you compare to others on that list of 17, we have one of the longest histories of colonization among all peoples of the world. It's a badge that, is something that we're not proud to wear. And so being a US colony, what exactly does that mean for us? And so some refer to our citizen status as second class because we don't have the full civil rights that American citizens have when you live in other jurisdictions in the US. We do have US passports. We don't vote for the US president. We have a symbolic vote, but it doesn't count towards the vote for the president. We have one congressional representative in the US Congress who has what is referred to as no true vote, which essentially means they're able to participate at different levels of voting. However, if their vote is the deciding vote, in other words, it's a tiebreaker, then our vote becomes null. So it really creates this illusion of inclusion in the democratic process, even though in fact it's just an illusion and we have no real power. A GAO report out of the US Congress indicated that as a territory, we have limited federal funding and suggested that in its calculations that we receive about 1/7 of the funding that is afforded to states. And so in places like Guahan, as well as American Samoa, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands, you see this sort of colonial condition, which is as far as we can bring our communities with this very limited funding and investment from the metropole. As a colony, we also are excluded from a number of different standard US social supports programs, such as unemployment insurance, for example, and certain kinds of social security programs that again are afforded to people who live in the 50 continuous US states. And there are very specific federal territorial policies that are restrictive, particularly the example I give here is the Jones Act, which does not allow us to fully develop our local economy. So it's really part of the trappings by design, structural trappings to keep us sort of in the situation that we're in. And so when we look at what has colonial militarism meant for Guahan, these are just images of what this means, right? We see in the left corner harm and hurt to our physical bodies from testing, from environmental toxicity. You have hyper-militarization, right? You see a picture here of our men holding all of the different branches of the US Armed Forces in a parade. You see our elders who are loyal and patriotic because of the war experience and being quote unquote liberated by the US when they came back to reclaim the island and recolonize us. And you see all these reminders, monuments, so much of when you're a tourist and you come to Guahan or even further into our region, tourism is built around the military story, right? So in so many ways, it's a huge part of our experience. We're hyper-militarized, yet at the same time, we've become very desensitized to militarization from this experience. And so as most of you are aware, because a lot of us are from the Asia Pacific region, in 2011, Obama had revealed his Asia Pacific pivot strategy. And this really has had a lot to do with the hyper-militarization, not just of Guahan, but of our entire region. And so in that plan that was rolled out, it was primarily motivated by what they called the containment of China, both economically and militarily. And we saw the fortification of military expansion in our different jurisdictions. And in our case, involved the development of a Marine base, as well as a THAAD, which now has evolved into a much more complex system, and continued expansion on the already existing military footprint on the island. I want to share a caveat as I continue to talk about the military buildup that's been planned since 2006, that already, even before that, the US Department of Defense has occupied about 31%, between 29 and 31%, depending on what you count, has been their footprint already. And so when I talk about this military expansion, we're talking about this in addition to that very big footprint on our island that exists. Part of the Asia Pacific pivot, of course, Okinawa, which is really, really critical as the southernmost prefecture in Japan that has been burdened with at least around about 75% of US troops being in their homeland, particularly focused in the areas of Hinoko and Takai, where people's struggles continue to resist that expansion. In Hawaii, the pivot talked about the further development of Pohakuloa on the Big Island. In Australia, expansions in the northern city of Darwin, where there already exists military Marines, US Marines. And with the Philippines, we saw EDCA, right, which is that Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. And in South Korea, of course, as you all are familiar, many of you, and we have Sung-hee in our group here, who's a real champion for the protection of Jeju Island, and of course, Pyeongtaek and Ganjong that was under attack even earlier than that. And overall, what was anticipated, at least at the time of 2011, was a decrease in the total US defense budget. But what we did see was an increase in the total Asia Pacific component of that budget. And it's important for us to realize or to recognize that when we talk about the US and the tentacles of their Department of Defense, we're talking about over 800 military bases that are strewn in 70 different countries. And so I wanted to share a quote here around the time of the Asia Pacific pivot from a Captain Robert Lee in reference to the proposed military, or not what is now the ongoing military buildup of our island. And so he says, and I quote, "We're seeing a realignment of forces away from Cold War theaters to Pacific theaters, and Guam is ideal for us because it is a US territory and therefore gives us maximum flexibility," right? And I highlight the concept of maximum flexibility, which essentially means because we are a territory, they can do what they wish without the consultation of the people. And so when we look at the continued expansion of bases, we see all kinds of stuff going on. In the existing bases, we see 224 million that was earmarked for naval base expansion plans. And those were all embedded in the National Defense Authorization Act in US Congress. Of course, they're constantly talking about the interoperability across bases, and this is not just within our island, but across the Asia Pacific region. And ultimately the non-consultation, even with our locally elected government, right? We oftentimes hear about these plans as an afterthought. When we first heard about the transfer of Marines from Okinawa to Guahan in 2006, our primary source, even for our governor, was from mainstream Japan media that came to our ears. And as Indigenous peoples, we clearly have the right to what is defined as FPIC, which stands for free, prior, and informed consent. And at no point or juncture has there been any real clear, true consultation with our Indigenous peoples and the impact of military expansion on our island. And so what has the US legacy to Guahan meant? It's meant a lot of things. We've been exposed to radiation. There's environmental devastation and toxic contamination with toxicity throughout the island. And of course, where you have radiation and toxicity, you have poor health outcomes. It has also meant the prohibition of many traditional practices. For example, by using traditional fishing grounds for the development of the bases and not allowing us access to those grounds, prohibition of our language, and even the taking of lands in traditional sacred ancestral villages, as well as the inability to access certain medicinal plants that we use for our traditional medicines. Land acquisition is one of the most painful part of the experience of militarization. And you can see different percentages here ranging from 80% to 29% that has comprised the US DoD's footprint on our island. And of course, this is taking away ancestral lands from Pacific peoples, and consistent for Chamorros, consistent with other Pacific peoples, our connection to land is very sacred. And it's connection that has existed for multiple generations, and that really is our connection to our ancestors. So when you take traditional lands, homelands of people, it's really traumatic for us. There's an existing segregated school system between the Department of Defense students and our local students, and ultimately is the deferment of Chamorros' right to political self-determination, right? Be able to resolve our political status options and exercise our right to decolonization so that we can govern ourselves. I wanted to share a slide here, starting with the top of that list of radiation exposure. And as you can see here at the center, you have Bikini Atoll and the Marshall Islands. And so this here circle is the fallout, the radiation, the circumference of fallout. And as you can see, Guam is within that radius. And so what we've experienced is that because we are within direct downwind of the Marshall Islands, radiation came to us during the time of the massive atomic testing. And so we see in this slide here, strontium-90 levels that were recorded on our island in comparison to Majuro Island, which is the capital of the Marshall Islands, between 1968 and 1974, which was clearly during that the atomic testing period. And what you see in many of these years is that the levels on Guahan were even higher than the levels in Majuro for strontium-90, which is one of the radioactive isotopes that's really problematic when it comes to impacting health. Other environmental contamination on the military bases, for example, of Anderson and Naval Base, combined, there's about 95 toxic sites. This is at one point of inquiry. Okay, so these numbers are fluid and over time, but at one point of inquiry, there were 95 toxic sites, and the status that they had given us of each of these cleanups were designated as such, as having 41 had been quote unquote cleaned up, 22 sites had been complete, 16 were in long-term management status. And, you know, as we look at these, it's important to understand that there are, because the devastation to the environment is so severe, oftentimes their cleanup efforts are insufficient to create a safe environment, physical environment, even if they've quote unquote cleaned it up. And part of environmental degradation includes a total of 30 Superfund sites on island. And these are sites that are deemed by the US Environmental Protection Agency as being the most toxic sites in the United States, that it requires massive amounts of money to remediate. And as I said earlier, where there's toxicity, there's going to be health problems. And so we see this. And this is an old study that was done on Guahan that looked at 25-year period of death certificates due to cancer. And their study indicated, and I have it highlighted in green, that the villages of Jeju and Santa Rita had the highest incident rates of cancer. And those are the two villages that host the two biggest military bases on the island. And so this is a slide just to illustrate exactly what big problem we have in terms of cancer cases and cancer mortality. And so in each of these different kinds of cancer, and I list them all down here, the aqua bar is that of Chamorros, and the green bar is that of the US national average for these types of cancer. So it's very illustrative of how much of a problem we have in comparison to the US when it comes to incidence of cancer. I just wanted to share this slide as well, because whenever a community is in trouble, problems manifest in our children. And we see this among Chamorros as well. Looking at Ifamagunta, which is our children's mental health system on the island, 77.1% of their clients in this 5-year period were Chamorro. And we only comprise less than 40% of the population. So what you're seeing here is a disproportionately higher rate of our children being sick in terms of their mental functioning. The Washington Post did a story on our island. They had come out to visit, and I like to use a quote that the reporter Blaine Hardin had wrote, and I have it here and I'll read it. Quote, "People here grow up with war ringing in their ears as described by their grandparents." And he discusses in his article how Chamorros and others throughout the Pacific island jurisdictions in Micronesia collectively have the highest rate of death by war per 100,000 inhabitants. And you see this here with our figure at 5.8 in comparison to the US's average. The US's rate of 1.44, and in comparison to other US states. So clearly our people are enlisting in the US Armed Forces at much higher rates than anywhere else, which is part of the US's economic conscripts for its colonies, right? Because we're very poor communities, right? We have very limited federal funding, we're poor communities. And so because we enlist so high, we also are the ones that are paying the greatest sacrifice in terms of death. So going back to the development of US bases, Department of Defense controls about 31% of the island, or over 35,000 acres. This here image is a picture of our island itself. And that is more than all private landowners combined. And their recent expansions of AMIT and AMERC have expanded into the ocean space and the airspace. And clearly that is more than what the holdings of our local government. Just to contextualize how much we're talking about in terms of land space, not just for Guahan, but for our region. In March of 2013, Department of Defense talked about a plan to, and I'm going to just go right down here through the quote here, if these plans are allowed to unfold, 1/3 of Guam, 2/3 of Tinian Island, and the entire island of FDM and Pagan would fall under the control of US Department of Defense. So these are islands, Guahan, including islands to the north in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, but that there really illustrates exactly what we're talking about. And the island of Pagan, on the right side here are images of Pagan, and it's this really pristine, untouched homeland of some Chamorros. In addition, there were colonial English policy, English-only policies, basically saying, and this was part of the propaganda that was circulated in the 1920s on island, English will bring to the people of Guam through the public schools a knowledge of sanitation and hygiene, which will enable them to live in a correct manner, right? So this kind of, this quote here clearly illustrates the kinds of colonial policies that were imposed to really influence and shape and govern our lives as Chamorros. And so when we look at the military buildup that's planned, and this was announced in 2006, I keep using the word plan, but it's in full swing construction at the moment. The main reason that people that welcomed the buildup did so was with economic promise. And so I just wanted to share a few slides that talked about the economic, the other side of the economic story. And so the FSEIS, which is the final environmental impact statements of their redoing after we sued them, basically stated that lower income people are more likely to slip into poverty under economic distress. Low income peoples are more financially vulnerable because they have fewer resources to support them in difficult economic times. The possible combination of higher cost of goods and services with higher housing costs would likely affect low-income people, while those with many resources may thrive economically due to enhanced business opportunities. Stressful economic circumstances may push people on the verge of poverty, into poverty, or even homelessness. And this is what we're already seeing, right? Guam has never, my entire life, never had a homelessness problem, but now our shelters that they've developed to try to address the poverty in the community are insufficient. And of late, the government it's one of its biggest challenges now. In addition, also from an appendix of this same report, quote, most civilian military jobs will likely go to either spouses of new active duty personnel or to labor brought in from off island. Less than 25% of civilian military jobs are expected to be filled by current Guam residents. Right. So while there's all this talk of economic progress, promise, what we know is that it really will not help the average person on Guam, particularly those who are struggling. So in summary, their plan suggests that there will be about $230 million construction boom, which we're in the midst of now, but it only lasts for a 5-year period, right? And the cost of 20,000 foreign labor workers' needs are absorbed by our civilian government. So what I'm referring here to is that there's foreign civilian workers that have been imported onto the island for the purposes of construction, and their needs are not able to be met outside or within the military fences. That burden is absorbed by our civilian government in terms of hospital and housing and so forth. There's massive impacts on our utility and water systems, and the cost of quote unquote readying our island has been placed on the burden and backs of our local government, not to mention the different social costs that exist. So clearly there's been a community outcry, okay? Partly because all of the money that's supposed to be touted, about $10 billion, partly funded by the government of Japan, will be spent within military fences. Over 10,000 public comments have been submitted expressing our concerns, and we had 90 days to digest an 11,000-page document about their revealed plan. They're talking about a population increase of about 45,000 people, dredging of acres of our reef for the harbor, and the construction of a missile defense system, which I know connects many of the bases that exist in our homelands. And so in our resistance has been various calls to action. Most recently, Protege Litektense Ritidian has been organizing particularly around protecting Ritidian, which is the land area owned by traditional landowners that's being used for the development of Camp Blaas, which is the name of the military base. In addition to that, cultural artifacts and historical sites have been interrupted, right, have been destroyed, have been removed. Laddie sets, for example, and Lusong, which are our sacred artifacts, have been, they're being unearthed, and there's violations to the programmatic agreement that was negotiated between our government and the Department of Defense. And pictured here is an endangered tree, which was the last lone Hadzun Lagu tree in this forest. And so our local legislature, as well as our governor, pleaded with the Department of Defense to pause construction while we take to the needs of preserving and protecting this tree. And those requests were denied, which is not uncharacteristic of a US colony. And so for us, what's at stake in terms of colonization as well as militarization is truly our very survival. That's all I have for you, Sidu Usmasi. Thank you very much.